Hello, I'm Catherine Barnes from University of South Australia, and today I have the pleasure of welcoming you to the Oceania RDA Committee webinar on practical implementation of official RDA at the National Library of New Zealand. Our presenter today will be Charlotte Christensen, a professionally registered librarian in New Zealand with a background in public libraries and over 2 decades experience in cataloguing. She's a member of RDAC and currently the RDAC representative on the RDA Steering Committee. Beyond her involvement with official RDA, she's also a member of the working group behind subject access in Maui materials and provides cataloguing standards advice to the New Zealand Public Library Consortium of over 40 libraries. Later in the presentation, Charlotte will be joined by 2 colleagues from the National Library of New Zealand, Team Leaders Collection Description, Anushka Maguire and Teresa Preston. This presentation will be recorded so you can look back later, and please ask your questions in the Q&A section there. Over to Charlotte.
Thank you, Catherine. I'll just share my screen. And off we go. Tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings to you all. My name is Charlotte Christensen, and I'm pleased to be able to be here today to talk about our implementation of official RDA at Te Puna Mātauranga o Aotearoa National Library of New Zealand. That's a bit of a mouthful, so I'm going to refer to my institution as NLNZ for the remainder of the presentation. This is also the abbreviation you will see on our policy statements and documentation. But before we begin, I will share a very short whakatauki in Māori to focus us all on the sharing to come. Aha koe iti no te āwhina mā te aroha e whakanui. Nō reira e hoa mā kia ora rā. On the screen here are the 3 previous presentations relating to NLNZ's implementation of official RDA. The most recent being Eb Curtis's presentation at the public session of the April RDA Steering Committee meeting. I mention them because together they build a fuller picture than I can give in any one presentation. I would recommend viewing these at some point if you have not already had the opportunity to do so. For today, I'll begin by briefly highlighting some of the points made in previous sessions because they're key to understanding our philosophy behind our implementation. Firstly, our approach is to have everything RDA related accessible within the toolkit itself. Secondly, our training heavily emphasised RDA, totally excluding any consideration of encoding until the very end, because encoding methods can change, but the data that's important to our descriptions should remain the same. In terms of training, it was entirely our intention to train for understanding, to ensure that every cataloguer wasn't just repeating past actions, but was able to fully engage with the new standard and the underlying model of LRM. And so we dwelt on concepts and language to build that understanding. Which leads to the next thing, which is that at NLNZ, everyone contributes. While most of the policy and documentation writing is done by the senior staff, everyone down to the most junior of cataloguers is exposed to all the material and theory and can make informed suggestions for policy change or improvement. Our choice to give everyone that deep understanding did, of course, add to how long it took to get through our training. But it's important to recognise that whatever level you train at, transition will take time. Learning about a new concept is one thing. Applying it in a practical environment is another and may require refreshers, reminders, and ongoing evaluation of which aspects might still be challenging. For us, we knew when we implemented that we didn't have everything perfectly finished, but we had gone far enough that the people we were training could contribute to finding problems and helping to fix them. We didn't want to delay until it was perfect, and honestly we couldn't have, because it was when the practical cataloguing started that we discovered gaps we hadn't realised existed. Allowing practitioners to contribute to discussions meant a broader range of perspectives and a better result in our documentation. Finally, while it took a long time to get here, the end result is that our policies reflect intentional choices right down to the option-by-option level. We have analysed the implications of different choices, and we have determined which ones best fit our needs, the community we serve, and the interoperability of our data with other systems. We have tested every past practice to see if it is still fit for purpose, abandoned some which don't fit our needs, and taken new approaches where they offer better future possibilities. Looking closer at how we structured our training, it's important to remember that we didn't leap directly into the practical. It was absolutely critical to ensure we had a strong foundation of understanding so we could progress forward together. Starting with phase 1, we recognised that a major barrier in moving to official RDA is that many cataloguers don't like the new language and structures. That's okay as a first reaction. It is different and challenging, but it's less of a challenge than it first appears. Cataloguers trained under AACR2 had to learn language in order to understand those rules. This is the same thing. That new jargon becomes familiar and comfortable as you interact with it. The plain truth is that you cannot interact effectively with the instructions in the toolkit if you don't understand what they say. So knuckling down and engaging with the new terminology from the start is important. To do that, you're going to need people who can encourage the cataloguers to make the effort. NLNZ's experience has been that everyone can engage with the official RDA standard in much the same way as they have done with previous standards. It's about the foundations being solid, and so supporting people to engage through that learning phase is critical. Phase 2 was about building on that understanding and making a deeper dive into concepts we were about to actively use. Phase 1 had been slow-paced and bite-sized, but Phase 2 was deliberately intensive because we wanted concepts clear and fresh before cataloguers began directly engaging with the toolkit. So we did all of Phase 2 across a single week and immediately prior to beginning the practical training phase. To this point, only the policy group had been engaging directly with the toolkit and the NLNZ documentation, but as we moved to the practical training component, it became much more interactive. During the first part of the initial training, we worked with a pattern of having new information disseminated at the start of the week, practical activities for everyone to engage with whatever was being taught, and then small group discussions to get feedback on how the week had gone. The Monday tutorials were led by a rotation of the policy group members and were always recorded so that trainees could go back over anything that they had missed. The change in presenters gave trainees a chance to hear messages in different ways and took pressure off any one person being the lead for the training. This was a collaborative effort all the way through. Similarly, the policy group were distributed across the small discussion groups. These sessions were both a chance to gauge how well concepts and activities had been understood, and also to capture any documentation problems that had been encountered. Sometimes the feedback resulted in a single concept being extended over a second week as we made changes and retested our approach. When we got to implementation itself, we moved to a peer checking model. Issues were still fed back to the policy group, and we retained the small group concept, but now as optional clinics where questions and issues could be discussed and worked out together. This was never a top-down experience. Cataloguers were encouraged to think about the issues for themselves and to suggest resolutions to the problems they found. While the clinics were very well attended early on, the need for them diminished quickly. What was initially a vital tool simply became redundant as confidence and familiarity grew. We are now well beyond that implementation phase, but there is still activity ongoing, and two aspects of that activity seem particularly worth mentioning. The first is that all the way through our training journey, we had a dedicated discussion channel where recordings, slides and notes could be put, and where questions could be asked and answered. We can look back over how our thinking has developed and where practical use of our documentation has led to policy change. This tool has been and continues to be really valuable. The second is that we implemented initially for only a narrow range of material, static, text-based resources. But training has been ongoing for other types of material, building on what is now known and understood. There are subgroups who are repeating the earlier pattern of tutorials, activities, and discussion groups for resources such as notated music, rare books, and diachronic works. The same iterative development is also occurring for these areas, with documentation being improved through practical engagement. And so, once each subgroup implements, the training materials are then collated and made available, while new subgroups are formed. In this way, we will work through the remaining resources for which internal training has not yet been completed. When it comes to the actual cataloguing of resources, we make regular use of what we call MAPs, our metadata application profiles. These are subsets of the overall NLNZ application profile, focusing on the key elements important for particular types of metadata description sets. Our training began with a focus on static, text-based resources, but just to cover that slice of our daily work, we have 4 separate maps, 1 for non-aggregates and 3 for different types of aggregate, augmentation, collection, and parallel. This would have been too much to take in on day 1 of the practical training, and so instead we started with training maps. These training maps were heavily curated, listing only the elements covered by the training, and trainees were expected to only use the elements listed rather than exploring other elements at this stage. For example, at week 1, we had a very limited range of manifestation elements and no elements from any other entity. But by week 7, we had almost completely covered manifestation as well as all attribute elements for work, expression, and item. Then, for weeks 8 to 11, we focused on access points, and so our maps stepped away from the elements we were already familiar with to focus only on those that helped us with that learning. While the live Toolkit versions of these training maps are not publicly accessible, there are PDF versions available through our Niche Academy tutorials. These are hyperlinked, so you're able to make use of them directly, but there is nothing to stop you developing your own maps if you want to cover more or less content than we did in a particular lesson. The key here is that this is simply a training tool, so make use of it where it's useful and adjust it where it isn't. We have certainly made adjustments as we went. And remember that we didn't wait to have everything in place, every decision made, before we started training. We started with a core and built on as training progressed, and staying flexible has worked out well. Moving beyond training though, let's look at the workflow of actually cataloguing an item. When starting to catalogue, there are a number of decisions that need to be made before I even work on recording my first value. I need to start by deciding whether my resource is static or diachronic, then determining how many works are involved in the resource I'm describing. Because I'm supported by the NLNZ policies and guidance, I make use of the NLNZ aggregate guidance to convert that knowledge of how many works I have into which metadata application profile, or MAP, I need to use in my description. Finally, I need to check whether there is an existing description available to me, and if so, whether I can use it or whether I'm required to begin a new description. So here's a resource to use as an example. It's a static work. There's no indication of it being diachronic. It's text-based. There are no illustrations other than the cover image, and there are no other works, so no introductions or other such textual content that would give me multiple works. So following through the aggregates guidance, I come to the conclusion I have a non-aggregate, and I will be using the static non-aggregate text map. The next step is to work through the elements on that map and do my thinking about my RDA values. In our training, we used a simple worksheet to list our RDA values and keep our thinking separate from the encoding of those values. I've mostly completed my worksheet for this resource, but I still have a few elements to complete, 2 of which we'll do together. In other words, yes, we're going to do some actual cataloguing. Now, While I'm sure you're excited to hear me say that, keep in mind we only have a limited amount of time, so this is more about the flow of the work than an actual lesson. For a few people, I'll be going too slowly, and you'll be wondering how I could possibly get through a cataloging backlog if I'm spending this long on each element. For most of you, though, I suspect I'll be going way too fast and skipping through things that you're unfamiliar with. And all I can do is apologize. The truth is that when you are learning to use the toolkit, you have to work much slower than I will today. And when you're familiar with it, you simply won't spend this long on every element, only on the bits that are unique to the resource you're working on and with which you're unfamiliar. So I'm probably pleasing no one, but I'm hoping you'll get something from this demonstration anyway. The first element I will demonstrate is manifestation file type. The map tells me that this is an element I should consider for the description of my resource. I'm told I should record it if it's applicable, and that it's possible to record more than one value. Let's transfer to the live toolkit and follow this through. So here I am at the static non-aggregate text map, and I'm going to file type. Going to the element, I read the definition, and since I'm dealing with a digital file, this sounds like it would be applicable. Next, I go to the pre-recording section, which will tell me if there's anything that might change my mind about recording a value here. NLNZ does have a policy statement here, but it relates to integrating resources, so I don't need to worry about that for this resource. Next, I move to the recording section, and I'm told to use the structured description recording method, so I can scroll straight down to that section now. The first option here has a policy statement that tells me I'm going to apply the option, but to record only for the version held by NLNZ. Of the values in this vocabulary encoding scheme, or VES, the one that fits my resource is text file, so that will be my value. While I'm here, though, I note that this VES has a name. It is the RDA file type vocabulary encoding scheme. That will be important soon. The next option has a policy statement saying do not apply, so I won't even read the option. The third one says apply, and specifically to apply a particular option on the data provenance page. The option here tells me that I need to record a vocabulary encoding scheme that is used as a source of information for a term. It then tells me I can follow this link to get general guidance about that. Well, I did take a term from a VES, and so because I apply this option, I now have to say what that VES was, and I do that by applying the option that the link in the policy statement takes me to. Once the page loads, the option I need is right at the top of the screen. I do not scroll up or down. It tells me that I'm going to apply the option. So I read the condition option, which says I'm going to record the source of information as a work source consulted of the metadata work. Now, to understand what this means, I need to remember that each value I record is part of a metadata statement, and a metadata statement is also a metadata work. So my statement is manifestation has file type text file. When I read this option, I'm being told I need to record a source for the value text file within that statement. Understanding that, I see I'm told to record my source as a value of the element work source consulted. So off I go to that element. At pre-recording here, I'm told that for situations where I want to refer to a source without using an appellation, I need to use the element work note on metadata work. Now I need to remember that appellation means name or label. So the question is, did my value text file come from a list with a name? Well, yes, it did. We took note of that. It was called the RDA file type vocabulary encoding scheme. So we do have an appellation, and that means I can use the element work source consulted. Our recording method, however, is not so straightforward. There are 3 different methods listed here at the recording heading, but I'm also advised to go off to the NLNZ guidance document. So off I go. Now, this is a little bit slow to load. We are working on a technical fix to this, but it's reliant on a toolkit release. Hopefully we'll have this in the June release. Okay, so here we are at Work Source Consulted, and I came from the recording heading, so that's the section I need to look at. And here I see there are subsections for each of the recording methods. I'm told to use unstructured description if I'm thinking about values of title proper, statement of responsibility, or variant title, but I'm looking for a relationship to file type. So I keep reading. Structured description is only for authority work. So I move on to identifier. And here at identifier, I find I can use this for file type. At the bottom of this section, I'm told to use identifiers from one of 2 lists, and of these 2, I'm going to choose the genre form code and term source codes list. Now that I'm here, I can do a search on the page for the name of my VES RDA file type, and there it is. I see that my value is RDA FT. So let's put all of that into my worksheet. I have manifestation, has file type text file, that's my value, which was a structured description value. And for my source, I have work, has source consulted, RDA FT. Let's move on to a new element, expression, language of expression. The map tells me that this is a mandatory element for this kind of description, and that I can have more than one value if applicable. So let's go back to the toolkit. And I will just work my way back from where I am until I get to my map, and then go down to expression, language of expression. The definition looks good. At the pre-recording policy statement, I have information about aggregated expressions, but I already know my resource is a non-aggregate, so I don't need to be concerned about that. There's also some information at RDA at this section, the main point being that if there's a change in value, it might indicate an entity boundary. This is relatively obvious in a practical sense. If I have a record for my resource already in my catalogue, and that particular record is for the German version, and I'm working on an English expression, then this will be a different description than for the German one. So that's fine too. I understand what it means, and I don't need to think about it for my resource. What about my recording method? Well, just like with Source Consulted, I have multiple possibilities and an instruction to go and see NLNZ guidance to find out what to do. And we just wait for that to load again. Again, hopefully in the June release, we'll get this fix in. Here we are at expression, language of expression, and we're at the heading recording. And here I have a nice simple instruction, use identifier recording method. There's some additional information about when and how I can use an unstructured description, but these situations don't apply to my resource, so all I need to know is that I'm going to use the identifier method, and I go back to the toolkit. I can now go straight down to the section Recording an Identifier. And at the first option, the policy statement tells me I'm going to apply this option using the MARC code list for languages code sequence. The option says I will record an identifier or notation from an appropriate VES. My policy statement has told me the VES to use, so off I go to get that. And here I find the code for English is ENG. So that's my value. Returning to the toolkit, I keep working my way down the page and I see that the next option is one I don't apply. And then I'm at the end of the section. I'm not recording an IRI, so I'm done. In this case, once I've entered my value and recording method, I am done. Even though my value came from a vocabulary encoding scheme, I was not instructed to record the source, and so I didn't. So my worksheet is complete, and here are the values we just worked out together. But I'm not done yet. I still need to put my values into our encoding format, which for NLNZ is Mark 21. So let's talk about Mark for a bit. NLNZ has used Mark 21 for decades, so it would be easy to believe we wouldn't even need to teach our staff encoding, but that simply wasn't the reality. RDA and Mark use different language and are not fully aligned. The Mark manual often does not reflect the element names from official RDA, and even when it does, it might define them slightly differently. So you need something to tell you where to put your RDA values in Mark. But that isn't the only reason we kept them so separate, nor why we felt we had to spend a little time on Mark training, in spite of working with staff who had had years of experience using Mark 21. One of the big issues with Mark encoding when you're trying to deal with RDA values is that a lot of what we see in Mark is implicit rather than explicit. If I give you the following Mark coding and value, what RDA value might this be? Well, the obvious answer is that it's a value of title proper, and that would be correct. But that's not all it is. It could also be considered part of the value of the element authorized access point for work. In this situation, there have been no previous publications of this resource, so we wouldn't usually add a 240 field since it would contain exactly the same information as in the 245 subfield A. But of course, neither the 245 subfield A nor the 240 value would have given me the full value of authorized access point for work in this case anyway, because you have to string together the value in the 100 field as well. As cataloguers, we know this and can interpret it, but this kind of implicit value recording is difficult for a computer to make use of. The 245 subfield A is sometimes only a value of title proper, but in this case also a value, or at least part of the value, of authorized access point for work. But it's not always part of the value of authorized access point for work. Taking a different but very well-known example, the value of title proper can differ from the title portion of the value of authorized access point for work. And we're very familiar with that happening in resources we describe. All of this is just a single illustration of implicit values in Mark. And it has to be said, after you've put the effort into knowing exactly what your values are and why you want to include them, it can be a bit disheartening to lose that clarity when you type it into your library management software, which is why we spent some time looking at where we can use Mark to be explicit about our data. So far as possible, we want to be able to identify our RDA values even while we continue to use Mark 21. And here's what we did. Firstly, we did not even do much thinking about Mark until after we'd decided which RDA element values we wanted to include. Keeping these separate meant we didn't get tangled in trying to figure out where to put things until after we knew we actually wanted to include them. Once we knew what we wanted, we then looked at all the possibilities for where each value could be encoded. This usually started off with fields and subfields we were familiar with, but then included exploring newer available fields and determining which gave us the best result. As we considered the options, we tried to prioritize solutions that gave us the most explicit and singular result. If the choice was between a field which would be used for many things and a field which would be specific, we generally chose the latter. There were compromises at times, but we did our best to keep our data as clear as possible. Which leads to the last step. Wherever possible, and especially where a field can be used in multiple ways, we label the data. This is an ongoing expansion, sometimes including URIs, but often simply an RDA element name in an appropriate labeling subfield is our current approach. The language in these labels is not always particularly user-friendly, and we have configured our public displays to avoid them for the most part. In many cases, our previous labels were not much better help to non-cataloguers, and by taking this approach, we are future-proofing our new data as far as possible by being explicit about what the value represents. If you're curious about what our choices have been, you can go to our website and see them listed. This page is adjusted every time we make a new choice about marked data because, as with everything, we are refining our approach as implementation reveals new information. But for now, let's go back to our resource and think about my workflow. I chose my map, I filled in my worksheet. Now what do I do? Still within the RDA toolkit, we have a document specifically about how we encode our RDA values. There are some introductory sections to cover general information, and at the very bottom we have some further information about non-RDA marks specific to our internal practices, but the majority of the document is organised by RDA element name. So, looking at the section for manifestation file type, you can see that in a marked bibliographic record, I'm given instruction on how to handle a structured description value, specifically in the 347 subfield A. It also tells me to include a particular phrase in the subfield 3, and to place my data provenance value in a subfield 2, and to use separate 347 fields for each file type value. Note that this does not repeat everything in the MARC manual. That is still there for me to consult when I need to. This simply provides the interface between RDA elements and MARC fields. Here at the section for language of expression, we have the possibility of two recording methods, unstructured description and identifier. For our description, we have an identifier value of this element. So I'm told to record it in an 041 field, specifically subfield A, and other specific advice is given, like don't repeat the same language value for each expression in an aggregate. Saying once that this English content is enough. We don't need to do it once for every short story in a collection, for example. And so what I would do is work through my whole worksheet, check where in MARC I should be recording my values and key them in, referring to the MARC manual as needed. But I don't need to take the time to do that here. Let's wrap this up. So thinking again about implementation as a process, there are a few messages we'd like to reinforce. Our first message to anyone watching is that we have done this and you can too. You don't have to start where we did and go through the thousands of options line by line. There are now a range of policy statements in the toolkit, so you can test some out and see if any of them mostly fits your needs and then just adapt the bits that don't. Building on the work of others is both sensible and efficient. Encouragement and support are the most powerful tools to ensure transition is effective. Staying with original RDA is not a valid option when that version of the standard is going to be removed. So finding a way forward is important, and official RDA is a functional tool which can be used to continue practices cataloguers are familiar with. What has changed is the language and structure of the instructions. As mentioned several times in this talk, when teaching official RDA, it's very important to keep clear about what relates to RDA and what belongs to your encoding standard. Many more experienced cataloguers are accustomed to taking shortcuts and talking about where the values might be put, but this can quickly become confusing because there is not a one-to-one match between encoding fields and RDA elements. So, when teaching RDA, talk in terms of RDA. Once you've determined your values, then you talk about the encoding, but avoid talking about encoding until you're ready to do that step. Remember, RDA provides the values that are what you want to say about your resource. Encoding is just how you put it into a computer. The RDA side is the intellectual side of the task. Finally, this is a great opportunity to question what it is you actually do need to say in your descriptions to meet the needs of your user community. Sometimes this might mean adding additional information, but sometimes it really just means scrutinizing those things you've always done. Who is using that data you're entering and in what way? Could information in a note be better used if it was provided in a different form, such as a search facet? There are implications to such choices, but NLNZ has found this to be a great opportunity to cease old practices that weren't really serving any purpose other than consistency for consistency's sake. We have also been looking forward to a future where we stop entering data into any kind of encoding system at all. Our ideal would be a simple form where we fill in the element values and press a button to get an output in whichever encoding system we've selected. Conversion of old MARC data to a different encoding system is hard, but there are things we can do now while we're still using MARC that will make that future conversion easier. So we're prioritizing those changes. Finally, what next for NLNZ? Well, first we need to finish developing the documentation and training for our own staff, particularly in areas such as cartographic materials and audiovisual. These are in progress, but not yet complete, as is the documentation and training for rare books, music, and diachronic works. As we complete our own training phase for all materials, we are also turning our attention to how we can support the New Zealand library community to transition as well. Our training materials are made public, but we may be able to provide advice as libraries prepare their own transition plans relevant to their situation. And thirdly, there are a number of matters that have come to our attention, both through the policy development phase and through daily cataloguing, that we feel need consideration by the RDA Steering Committee for change. As we focus less on developing documentation, we will have more capacity to consider which issues need to be prioritised and to working with RDAC to get these considered. Often the issues may only be relevant to a certain user community, but RDA is an international standard, and providing new options for handling situations does not necessarily mean change for everyone. It simply provides a path for those who need it. We look forward to contributing to the continuing internationalisation of the standard in this way. If, after hearing this talk, you feel like you want to know more about our experience, we're very happy to share. Please do get in touch. Your situation may not be identical to ours, but our training material is freely available through the RDA Toolkit website and can be used by individuals or teams. Our training materials do assume use of our own supporting documentation, but could still be of value to trainers planning training using other policy statement and guidance document sets. So please do have a look and see what might be useful to you. I'll just repeat that contact email here. Now, we've got about 20 minutes left today. To help answer questions, I'm joined by our cataloguing team leaders, Anushka Maguire and Teresa Preston. And thank you for your time. It would be wonderful to have a conversation about any aspect of what I've covered that you'd like to know more about.
Thank you, Charlotte. So we've got 4 questions in the Q&A there. First from Renata. Would yourself or Anushka or Teresa like to answer those ones?
We can answer the first one. How many cataloguers are there in the New Zealand cataloguing team, and how many were involved in the training program? So at the time that we were training, we had 21 collection description librarians. That was including 3 team leaders. And of that 21 people, we had a team of 10 who were responsible for the policy statement work and for the training.
Thank you, Charlotte. You may like to answer the second question there from Haliza.
Okay, so in the example of language of expression, why do you not need to record the source vocabulary or data provenance? It's actually MARC related. It's not something that is easy to record. in a MARC record the source of that code. If you're familiar with MARC coding, if we put our value of language of expression in the 041 field, it's not so easy to put that in, whereas something like file type, you can see that in the subfield too. There's a space for that. So some of our decisions have been coloured by our encoding system, and we've made different choices for different elements.
So Renata would also like to know, in the what we did slide, you mentioned a public label. Do you mean public as in cataloguers or in the end user?
So that was in relation to content in subfield E or subfield I. We were talking about our end user display in our public catalogue. So we have turned those off. It's hard to remember now, but AACR2 didn't have them. This is relationship designators were a new thing with original RDA, and even in original RDA, they're not all that friendly. We've kind of gotten used to them, but
Thank you. So Anushka and Teresa might like to answer the question about how large the training team was and how many people were being trained.
I think we answered that already. The total number of cataloguers or collection description librarians was 21, including the team leaders. Our training team, people who delivered the training, was 10.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's important to note that our policy writers were not fully trained before we started the training. Yeah. So our training program was very much everyone learning together. So although our senior staff would be facilitating and presenting, they were also upskilling themselves at the same time along with everyone else. They also contributed as learners in the team environment as well.
Although having done the policy work, yes, we're all very well familiar with.
Yes, it's just that difference between you know what it should be, but when you have something in front of you, sometimes it's a little harder to work out what it actually is going on.
Yeah, just thinking about the broader New Zealand library community, what is the role? I saw sort of next steps, about the next steps there. What do you think the role would be with your particular expertise you've now developed in the training to spread out to the wider New Zealand library community? Any plans?
Yeah, our focus is on supporting and it really depends what people feel they need. I've spent most of my career in small special libraries, so I'm very aware that if you are in a special library doing descriptive work, you're also doing a million other things, and you don't have time to engage at a deep level. That's why our training is arranged the way it is, in bite-sized bits, so that you can come and go, take your time, self-paced, work in groups if you can. But yes, so I think that's really what we're looking at building on. What we haven't got firm plans yet, but we are sort of thinking, how can we provide a space or opportunities to support people as they work through that, and that is our plan for our focus for next year, so that we have plenty of time before May 2027.
Thank you. We've also got a question here related to example of changes that can be made to the MARC records in order to make conversion easier. Who wants to answer that one?
I have just put into the chat, which I hope did go to everyone, the link to all of the changes we have made to the major ones. So to pick up on the example that I was giving in the talk, instead of using the 130 or the 240 to partially, sometimes, but not always, give a value of authorised access point for work, we are now regularly recording either a value of expression manifested or work manifested elsewhere in the record, and we are labeling those as what they are so that it's a string that a computer can make use of, and you don't have to pick from different parts of the record to compile it.
I'll unmute myself. Thank you. But a good question here from Juliana. What amount of difference is there in the NLNZ PSs compared with others in the toolkit, approximately, and where were the main divergences you found?
Shall I start with this one and then I'll pass to the other two? I think our approach is really where the difference is. Our approach was we don't want to leave the toolkit. We want people to be able to be in the one place, get all the information they need when they need it, and not have to worry about going to a different site for this, a different site for that. And so our instructions are very integrated and very specific. We have gone through every single option and made a choice. Yes, we do this, or no, we don't. And that makes it very clear. The cataloguer doesn't have to make a choice. Should I do this? It's presented. There's still flexibility in there for when you get those really unusual things, but we're very clear. Anushka and Teresa, did you want to add anything to that?
I don't know that we've identified any areas where there is major divergence from, for example, PCC practice or Library of Congress practice at this point. Just trying to think.
In some ways, we are a bit ahead of things. So just how we manage aggregates, for example, we can't tell how other people are doing that yet because
or
they haven't.
Diachronic works, like, the areas where I think we probably may have divergence of practice are areas where nobody else has implemented yet. So that is hard to tell. Although I would say aggregates probably. But,
Thank you. And there are some unique world-leading ways with New Zealand, and one of these questions relates to that. Do you regard bilingual works, natively in English and Te Reo Maui, for example, as an aggregate work?
Well, we'd work through our aggregates guidance and we'd think very carefully about what the work was and how that work was being expressed. Is it one work that's being expressed in both English and Māori, for example? Is it clearly one work? Or do we have a manifestation that contains multiple works, each of which might be expressed in a different language? I think that's probably the core of it. You have to, and that's a big part of the aggregates. The aggregates model is different. It's new, but if you slow down and work through the questions as we have, you get to an answer in a way of dealing with it, because you have to think through what it is you actually have in the manifestation that you're holding in your hand. And sometimes it's one thing, and sometimes it's a different thing, and sometimes you think it's one thing and it turns out that it was something completely different. It's a case by case basis.
Catherine,
This one relates.
just pointing out, there are also a couple of questions in the chat that have just come to the hosts. So just letting you know.
Yeah. I guess just while we're mentioning language of expression, I'll just pull out another question on that. Why not language of expression in 008?
So we do record information in the 008 language code. I think it's 35 to 37 or something. But that space only allows for a single language code, whereas the 041 allows you to be specific about how many languages there are and what those languages are. So while it's not that we're stopping doing the basic mark things like filling in the fixed fields, we're simply not relating the RDA values to those spaces because they don't fit nicely. You can't actually put all your RDA values in there. So yes, we are still recording language in the 008, but we are explicitly recording it in the 041 as our RDA values.
Thank you. And just moving to the chat there, just wondering if you have any good examples of catalogue records that you can share. It's just helpful to see the output. We saw the bit piece within your presentation, but perhaps in your niche academy, is there some examples there that one could access or somewhere else?
Not at the moment, but yes, that's a great idea, and we should pull out some examples.
Yeah.
We'll look at the best place to put them.
It's probably also worth keeping in mind we implemented on the 1st of August last year, so anything we've catalogued since then is an example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, I mean, Charlotte put up the nzmb@dia.gov.nz email. If you want them, we can just email and we can text them out.
And James has just let us know full record examples will be coming to the toolkit soon. So can I assume some of the NLNZ records will be some examples?
At this stage, it's my understanding the examples working group is doing some agnostic kinds of full examples. I have spoken to the examples editor about the possibility of providing some options where we can give results that are different in different policy statement sets. But as Anushka said, one of the tricky things is the end result of what we've done looks a lot like what we've always done, because what we've always done actually works for us. That's why we've always done it. So it can be quite tricky to actually see the difference. I think the difference between our policy statements and perhaps someone else's policy statements is that approach of we actually just want to step you through. So, yeah.
Thank you. So Katie's asked, for pictorial material, are you thinking of linking out to specialist standards such as DCRM-G or DCRM-G, given DCRM doesn't yet align with official RDA? This is a long question. Are you developing your own approach to description of pictorial material? That's the guts of the question.
I think with rare materials, that area is still being developed in terms of our own practice.
We do have a map.
We do have a map for rare materials, and it's been developed with close attention to the DCRN manual. I understand the rare books, there will be policy statements coming to the official toolkit for rare materials soon, maybe this year. I'm not exactly sure on the date for that, but it's kind of at this stage, we're being very clear about what we want to do, and then we're looking where there are standards that we work with to see what those standards are how they are being applied. And some of them just weaving our way between those.
It's probably worth just adding, in terms of pictorial materials, for the average pictorial work that's just general publication, we have already got maps that cover those, and our policy statements cover those. We don't have massive collections of purely pictorial material. We tend to have things like picture books and coffee table books. So our attention's been more on that type of pictorial material to date.
Another question, perhaps extending the scope of your project, is does NLNZ have plans for moving to BibFrame, which should work better than Mark with RDA?
Well, beta is that's a whole different thing. BibFrame is another encoding format that we can encode RDA data in. It does have a different data model, which means it is not a one-to-one alignment. Our approach to this point has been, as Charlotte talked about in the talk, is to be really clear about what it is that we want to say about resources using RDA, so that we're very clear what the values that we're recording for RDA elements are and how we decide on those. So once we've got that framework, then the decision about how we might map those values into a BibFrame environment then becomes just the same way that we approached our RDA to mark encoding decisions. So yeah, that's where we are at the moment. We're very clear about what we're doing, and then when BibFrame becomes something that we have to grapple with, like our vendor might provide us with an editor later this year, then we will know what we're doing. But I think the key, that's a message that I want to say again, like they're not one-to-one. BibFrame and RDA are not one-to-one. Different data models, you do have to think very carefully about how
we put into getting our RDA into Mark. We would have to then repeat to get it our RDA into BibFrame.
Yeah. And I guess that's part of the thing. All of us are thinking about our next steps, and the scope needs to be quite well designed, because you can have all of these different directions you can go in, and the future changes that can occur. So Anne's also asked, NLNZ are choosing to disaggregate separate RDA elements into separate mark elements. Is it an equally valid choice to continue the current practice of recording these in the same mark tags?
I think it's a valid choice. The reason we are choosing to split out and be very explicit is that we're aware that there will come a future time when we want to put our data in a different encoding scheme. And we may not yet know what that encoding scheme will be, but there will come that time when we need to get our data out of Mark, and data in Mark is muddly. So the more clear we can be about what each value is, the better our data will look when we transition to whatever it is, whether it's some kind of XML, or whether it's Dublin Core, or whether it's BibFrame. It doesn't really matter as long as we know what the values are. If libraries choose to retain current practices, that's entirely up to them.
Thank you. And our last question here sort of merged together. It relates to the RDA Toolkit. The cartographic maps and PS will be in the June release in the Toolkit, so keep an eye out for that. But there was a question there related to can all libraries record their own policy statements freely in the official RDA Toolkit? You could just discuss that process.
I think Jamie. The process is quite. I guess yes. The answer is yes if you're prepared to do that work. And Jamie.
Hi. The short answer is no. I usually reserve policy statements arrangements for not individual libraries, but libraries that serve a large population, like a country or something like that, or a unique group. We have a law library policy statements coming. OLAC is doing policy statements. I think the Quebec will have policy statements, etc. So as long as, but if Harvard wanted to do policy statements, I'd probably say no, unless they gave me a lot of money. But there are ways around it. You could use the bookmarks the bookmarks or note feature in the toolkit and share them locally within your library. So you could go in and put those notes in wherever you like in the toolkit. You could also create a document with links. So there's a document and you can put it into the toolkit and they can just go through the order and click on the links and get the information they need. So the answer is no, but there's always a way around it.
Thank you.
We at NLNZ do have policy statements, but we've made heavy use of the HTML editor. And you can, as long as you have a Toolkit subscription, you can make documents that way and make them available at whatever level is working for you. So there is that as well.
I guess that leads to the final question, which references the toolkit. Is there no reference to guidance documents outside the toolkit? Because the toolkit comes at a cost to organisations.
We
Our guidance
don't.
documents are publicly available. So I believe if we've set them to public, so you don't need to have a Toolkit subscription to see them. But having said that, they are intertwined into RDA Toolkit, so you can't really use them without a subscription. And yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, Charlotte, Anushka and Teresa today. Really appreciate the guidance there and sharing your project, but also those next steps there, so everyone can sort of think about their own approaches and have a greater understanding. The email address was shared in one of the slides, so that's a good contact for any further questions there. But also I recommend accessing some of the resources that Charlotte shared in the PowerPoint slides. This recording will be sent to all registrants, but also available via YouTube. So feel free to go back over that and look at the content. We have an extra Q&A session planned for Monday, the 19th of May. So next Monday, 11 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard, 1 p.m. New Zealand, and 9 a.m. Singapore. The URL will be provided later this week. So thank you very much for everyone who engaged with this session today. It's been wonderful to see everyone thinking about their next steps and looking at an implementation that's taken place. We're very fortunate to have the generosity of NLNZ to share their story and to be freely providing resources for those of us starting on the journey. So thank you for that. And hopefully we'll see you more in future. We've got an Australian session planned for June, so keep your eyes out for some advertising for the Australian project presentation. Thank you very much.